You smell ether before you understand what it means. A sweet chemical odor that fills the air like invisible smoke, clinging to everything, seeping into clothes and hair and the back of your throat where it lingers as a warning your body doesn't know how to interpret. Winter, 1943. The building is nondescript, brick facade that could house a factory or warehouse or any of the 1,000 utilitarian structures that cities build when function matters more than beauty. But inside, behind walls thick enough to muffle sound, science is happening, the kind that textbooks will mention carefully, footnotes that acknowledge contribution while avoiding details. Discoveries that changed medicine forever, but arrived through methods that make modern ethics committees physically uncomfortable. You are not standing in this building, not yet, but you will be. First, you need to understand what it means to volunteer for something you don't fully comprehend, to sign papers that use words like research and contribution and national service without specifying exactly what those words mean in practice, in the specific reality of your body becoming data. The year is 1943, and the world is divided into people who are fighting and people who are supporting the fighting. And supporting sometimes means offering yourself as an experimental subject because somebody needs to understand hypothermia or malaria or mustard gas exposure. And the only way to understand these things is to inflict them on humans and measure what happens. You are a conscientious objector, though that phrase carries weight it didn't have before the war. Before refusing to kill became its own kind of courage, before pacifism meant standing against the tide of national rage that demands everyone participate in violence or be labeled coward. You belong to a church that teaches nonviolence, Mennonite or Quaker, or one of the other denominations that take seriously the commandment about not killing, that believe morality doesn't suspend during wartime, that accept the social consequences of refusing to hold rifles. But refusing to fight doesn't mean refusing to serve. The draft boards understand this, create alternative service options for men whose consciences won't permit them to kill, but who still need to demonstrate loyalty, still need to prove they're not simply cowards hiding behind religion. Civilian Public Service, a program that sends objectors to fight fires or build roads or plant trees, useful work that doesn't involve bullets but also doesn't involve comfort or praise or the understanding that most people reserve for soldiers. Except some objectors volunteer for something else, medical experiments conducted by universities and research hospitals, studies designed to answer questions that the military needs answered but can't answer through animal testing because animals aren't human and humans are what's dying in specific ways that require specific understanding. The cold water tank waits, 10 feet long, filled with water maintained at precise temperature, cold enough to simulate North Atlantic conditions, cold enough that immersion produces immediate physiological responses that researchers document with the detachment that science requires. You undress, remove clothing until you're wearing only the minimum necessary for modesty, your skin already stippling with goosebumps from air that's merely cool, your body anticipating the shock before it arrives.
The immersion is violence disguised as procedure. Your body entering water so cold that every nerve ending reports emergency simultaneously. A sensory overload that makes thinking impossible for the first 30 seconds while your nervous system tries to process input it wasn't designed to handle. The researchers watch, clipboards ready, stopwatches synchronized, their faces showing the professional neutrality that scientists cultivate when their work requires observing suffering without intervening. Your breathing becomes ragged, sharp gasps that you can't control, hyperventilation triggered by cold shock response that bypasses conscious regulation. The water feels alive, actively hostile, pressing against your skin like something sentient that wants you gone, that resents your warmth and is working methodically to extract it. The tank's temperature is 36 degrees Fahrenheit, just above freezing, cold enough that your body begins shutting down peripheral circulation to preserve core temperature. Time distorts, seconds stretching into subjective eternities, while the clock on the wall advances with mechanical indifference. 5 minutes feel like 50, your mind cycling through awareness and confusion, through the desperate desire to escape and the will to continue because you volunteered for this, because ending early means the data is incomplete, because somewhere sailors are dying in water exactly this cold, and your suffering might eventually mean their survival. The researchers call out measurements, core temperature dropping, heart rate elevated then falling, fine motor control deteriorating as your fingers turn white then blue. They're documenting the stages: initial shock, progressive hypothermia, the point where shivering stops, not because you're warming, but because your body no longer has energy to generate heat through muscle contractions. This is valuable information, the kind that can't be obtained through theory or animal models, the kind that requires human subjects and human suffering, because only humans die exactly like humans. 15 minutes, your core temperature has dropped to 95 degrees Fahrenheit, officially hypothermic, your thinking cloudy with the particular confusion that comes when the brain itself is cooling. You try to speak, but words come slowly, tongue thick, jaw muscles reluctant to obey, syllables forming incorrectly like a recording played at wrong speed. The researchers note this, document the cognitive impairment, the progression from coherence to confusion, the markers that indicate how much longer you can remain conscious. They pull you out, not from mercy but from protocol, because letting you die would end the study and waste the data already collected. Your body doesn't want to move, muscles unresponsive, coordination absent, the simple act of climbing from the tank requiring assistance from technicians who handle you with the impersonal efficiency of people moving equipment. The warming begins immediately, not gentle, gradual warming, but aggressive reheating, hot water bottles and blankets, and sometimes warm water immersion, testing different recovery methods to determine which prevents the after-drop phenomenon where core temperature continues falling even after cold exposure ends. The pain of warming is worse than the cold, blood returning to frozen extremities, carrying sensations that make you wish for numbness again, nerves firing chaotically as they regain function, the burning ache that fills fingers and toes and spreads inward. You shake violently, teeth chattering hard enough that you fear they'll crack, muscles contracting in spasms that generate heat but feel like torture, your body fighting to reclaim the temperature it lost. The session ends, data recorded, observations noted, your contribution to science documented in notebooks that will eventually inform survival manuals and rescue protocols, and the treatment of hypothermia victims for decades after the session. You return to your quarters, a small room that you share with other volunteers, men who've participated in different experiments, but who all carry the same expression, the look of people who've learned that science often requires suffering, and suffering doesn't become less real just because it serves a purpose. But the cold water experiments are gentle compared to what happens elsewhere in the building, compared to the malaria wing where volunteers receive injections of infected blood and then wait for fever to spike, for parasites to multiply in their bloodstream at rates that researchers measure through daily blood draws. The progression is documented meticulously. Initial infection, latent period, the moment when fever climbs past 103 and consciousness begins to fragment. You watch volunteers cycle through treatments, quinine and atabrine and experimental compounds, some effective and some useless, all of them tested on human subjects because testing on animals won't reveal whether the drugs work in human blood against human malaria. Some volunteers recover quickly, fever breaking within days, parasites cleared, their bodies returning to baseline with minimal lasting effects. Others aren't as fortunate, complications developing, organs stressed by fever and parasites and the treatments themselves, some requiring hospitalization that extends weeks beyond the expected experimental period. The starvation study is slower, cruelty measured not in minutes of cold water, but in months of progressive caloric restriction, volunteers losing weight at rates carefully calculated to simulate European famine conditions.
You step into the water, not jumping, but easing in with the careful deliberation of someone who knows that hesitation only prolongs the inevitable. The cold hits like collision, not gradual but instant, a full-body assault that steals breath before you can think about breathing. Your muscles contract involuntarily, every fiber trying to generate heat through movement, through the ancient mammalian response to cold that worked when our ancestors needed to survive winter, but feels futile when the winter is artificial and controlled and maintained at exactly 2 degrees Celsius because precision matters when you're generating data. The researchers watch, clipboards ready, stopwatches synchronized, thermometers prepared to measure your core temperature through methods that are clinical and invasive and necessary, because skin temperature means nothing when what they need to understand is how quickly your organs cool, how long your heart can function when the blood feeding it drops below temperatures meant to sustain life. They're not cruel, not enjoying this, not sadistic in the way that makes atrocity simple to categorize. They're scientists, detached, methodical, committed to understanding that will save lives, even though the understanding requires inflicting suffering on bodies that volunteered for abstract contribution without fully grasping what contribution would feel like. 5 minutes in the water, and you're shaking violently. Uncontrollable tremors that make your teeth chatter hard enough to hurt, your jaw muscles cramping from the constant percussion. This is your body trying to generate heat, burning calories through movement, through the metabolic furnace that operates on the principle that motion creates warmth. But the water steals heat faster than shivering can produce it. Thermodynamics doesn't care about effort, doesn't reward trying,
just maintains the inexorable flow of thermal energy from your 98.6-degree body into the 2-degree water surrounding it. 10 minutes. Your extremities are numb now, fingers and toes losing sensation as blood flow redirects toward your core, toward the vital organs that must be protected, even if protecting them means sacrificing the periphery. Your skin is pale, bloodless, the capillaries constricted to prevent heat loss, your body making the terrible calculation that fingers can be lost but hearts cannot. The researchers note this, write observations in shorthand that reduces your suffering to data points, to measurements that will eventually become graphs and charts and published papers that other researchers will cite without thinking about the bodies that generated the numbers. 15 minutes. Consciousness begins to waver, not dramatically, but subtly, your thoughts becoming sluggish and unclear, like trying to think through fog. Hypothermia affects the brain, slows neural transmission, disrupts the electrochemical processes that create thought and memory and the sense of self that makes you more than just meat and bone. You try to focus, to maintain awareness, because losing awareness feels like losing yourself, like crossing a threshold you won't return from, even if they pull you out before your heart stops. The thermometer reads 32 degrees Celsius, 90 degrees Fahrenheit, mild hypothermia by clinical definition, severe enough that judgment is impaired and decision-making becomes unreliable, and the body's regulatory systems start failing in ways that cascade toward shutdown. They pull you out, not from mercy, but because the protocol specifies this temperature as the end point, because going further would risk permanent damage or death, and volunteers are valuable resources that shouldn't be wasted through carelessness. The rewarming is agony, worse than the cooling in ways you didn't anticipate, your body flooding with sensation as circulation returns to tissues that had gone numb. They wrap you in blankets, heated blankets maintained at specific temperatures, because rewarming too quickly causes its own damage, its own cascade of physiological problems. Your muscles ache, deep cramping pain that feels like your body punishing you for what you allowed to be done to it. But the data is recorded. Core temperature versus time immersed, plotted on graphs that will inform protocols for treating hypothermia victims, for understanding how long sailors can survive in cold water, for developing rewarming techniques that maximize survival rates. Your suffering has become science, transformed from subjective experience into objective measurement, from personal agony into knowledge that will outlast you. Other volunteers undergo different tortures in the name of research. The malaria studies at Stateville Penitentiary, prisoners injected with parasites, their fevers measured and documented as they spike to 105 degrees, as their bodies convulse with chills and delirium, as researchers test various treatments to see which ones reduce mortality without fully understanding mechanisms. The volunteers receive small payments, token compensation that acknowledges contribution without adequately valuing the price paid, money that makes the transaction feel less like exploitation, even though exploitation is exactly what it is when desperation or patriotism or religious conviction convinces people to offer their bodies for science. The starvation experiment in Minnesota, conscientious objectors housed in dormitories, fed precisely calculated rations designed to mimic concentration camp conditions, their weight dropping over months from healthy to skeletal. They become obsessed with food, talk about it constantly, dream about it, their entire mental landscape narrowing to the single fact of hunger that dominates every waking moment. The psychological effects are documented as carefully as the physical ones. Personality changes, depression, social withdrawal, the complete reorganization of consciousness around the absence of adequate calories. The researchers measure everything: weight loss and muscle wasting, cardiac function and metabolic rate, psychological resilience and breaking points. They learn that refeeding must be gradual, that flooding starved bodies with food causes its own catastrophic problems, that recovery requires patience and precision. This knowledge will save thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands, the survivors of concentration camps and famine, people whose liberation would mean nothing if liberation killed them through well-intentioned but physiologically catastrophic feeding.
The mustard gas experiments happen in chambers designed to contain horror, sealed rooms where volunteers sit breathing air that's been mixed with chemical weapons, where skin blisters and lungs burn, and researchers document progression with the same clinical detachment they bring to every experiment. The military needs to understand exposure, needs to know how quickly mustard gas incapacitates, what protective measures work, what treatments might save soldiers who encounter these weapons in the field. So they expose volunteers, mostly soldiers this time rather than conscientious objectors, mostly young men who are told this is safer than combat, even though safety is relative and blistered skin still hurts, whether it happens in a laboratory or a battlefield. The blisters form slowly, not immediately like fire, but gradually like some terrible flowering, skin raising into fluid-filled bubbles that burst and weep and leave raw tissue exposed to infection. The pain is comprehensive, not localized but spreading, affecting every inch of exposed skin, turning the simple act of moving into negotiation with agony. They photograph the progression, clinical documentation that will appear in classified reports, images of human suffering transformed into data about weapons effects, about how much exposure causes how much damage. Some volunteers lose vision, temporarily or permanently depending on exposure levels, mustard gas attacking the delicate tissues of the eye with particular efficiency. They stumble in darkness, their world reduced to pain, and the voices of researchers asking questions, documenting symptoms, measuring the distance between exposure and incapacitation. The treatments are experimental, various compounds applied to burned skin, various interventions tested to see which ones reduce damage, which ones speed healing, which ones do nothing except add another variable to the data set. The radiation experiments come later, during the war and after, continuing into the Cold War when understanding radiation exposure becomes urgent for different reasons. Volunteers receive injections of plutonium, told they're receiving treatments or vitamins or something harmless, lied to with the institutional confidence that comes from believing the research is important enough to justify deception. The radioactive isotopes lodge in bones, emit radiation for years, for decades, poisoning slowly from within, while researchers track health outcomes and cancer rates and the long-term effects that only become apparent after sufficient time has passed. Terminal patients receive experimental radiation therapy, doses far beyond what might be therapeutic. Researchers using dying bodies to understand lethal exposure limits, because dying people are going to die anyway, and their deaths might as well contribute to knowledge. The ethics are questionable, always questionable. The line between treatment and experimentation blurred until it's invisible. Consent obtained through the vulnerability of people who are desperate enough to believe anything that sounds like hope. The data accumulates, thousands of pages of observations and measurements, temperature curves and blood counts, symptom progressions and mortality rates. The science is legitimate, genuine contributions to understanding human physiology under extreme conditions, knowledge that saves lives through better treatment protocols and safety standards.
the Minnesota starvation study becomes the foundation for treating famine victims. The refeeding protocols developed through watching volunteers waste away, then recover, through understanding that the body needs time to remember how to process food after extended deprivation. The hypothermia research informs cold water survival guidelines, tells rescue services how long they have to save someone, what treatments work best, how to rewarm without causing cardiac arrest. The mustard gas data contributes to chemical weapons defense, protective equipment design, decontamination procedures, medical interventions that reduce mortality when exposure happens despite precautions. But the knowledge carries weight, the ethical shadow of how it was obtained, the understanding that every protocol based on this research is built on a foundation of human suffering that volunteers endured because they believed their pain served a higher purpose. Some volunteers break, psychologically, physically, the trauma of experimental participation, leaving scars that don't heal even after bodies recover. They dream about the cold water, wake shivering in warm rooms, their nervous systems unable to forget the sensation of core temperature dropping toward levels incompatible with consciousness. Others carry guilt, the survivors of the starvation study who recovered their weight but never recovered their relationship with food, who eat compulsively or restrictively, whose bodies remember hunger in ways that override rational thought. The psychological documentation is sparse. Researchers focused on physical outcomes, treating mental health as secondary concern or not a concern at all, assuming that volunteers would simply resume normal life once experiments concluded. The post-war reckoning comes gradually, first with Nuremberg, with the trials that establish medical ethics codes designed to prevent the atrocities committed in concentration camps, with principles like informed consent and right to withdraw that seem obvious in retrospect but weren't obvious enough to prevent the experiments from happening. The Allied experiments get different treatment, acknowledged but not condemned with the same vigor, justified through the lens of voluntary participation, even though voluntarism is complicated when volunteers are prisoners or objectors or people whose alternatives are worse than experimental participation. The research continues in modified form. Human experimentation doesn't end, but becomes regulated, subjected to oversight and ethical review, constrained by principles that prioritize subject welfare over scientific advancement. But the wartime data remains, cited in textbooks and medical journals, the foundation for treatments and protocols that save lives daily. Every hypothermia victim treated according to modern protocols benefits from knowledge obtained through experiments that would be illegal today.
The volunteers grow old, carrying secrets that few people want to hear. Stories about submitting to experiments in the name of science and patriotism, and the particular moral calculus that made suffering seem acceptable when weighed against potential good. They gather occasionally, reunions of men who shared experience too strange for outsiders to comprehend, who understand without explanation what it meant to volunteer your body as experimental substrate, to become living measurement device for phenomena that kill when not properly understood. Some speak publicly, give interviews to researchers studying the history of human experimentation, their voices carrying the weight of age and reflection and the complicated perspective that comes from surviving something you're not entirely sure was justified. They describe the cold, not just temperature, but the existential cold of being reduced to data point, of having your suffering measured and recorded and transformed into knowledge that benefits millions who will never know your name or understand what you endured on their behalf. Others remain silent, take their stories to graves marked with ordinary headstones that don't mention their contribution,
don't acknowledge that beneath this earth lies someone who advanced medical science through the offering of their own flesh and consciousness. Their families sometimes don't know. The experiments were classified or simply unmentioned, experiences too difficult to explain to people who weren't there, who can't understand the particular texture of choosing to suffer for abstract benefit. The ethical questions never resolve completely. Was it worth it? The thousands of hypothermia victims saved through protocols developed by watching volunteers nearly freeze? Do they balance the suffering of the men who shivered in Minnesota tanks? The famine survivors fed according to refeeding protocols discovered through the starvation study. Does their survival justify the trauma of volunteers who starved themselves for science? The mathematics are impossible. How do you weigh present suffering against future benefit, individual rights against collective good, the autonomy of volunteers against the needs of millions? Modern medicine inherits this complexity, builds on foundation that includes both brilliant innovation and ethical compromise, both genuine altruism and exploitation disguised as research. Every doctor who treats hypothermia uses knowledge obtained through experiments that ethics boards would never approve today. Every nutritionist who understands starvation physiology draws on data generated by watching conscientious objectors waste away in controlled conditions. The knowledge is inseparable from its origin. You can't unlearn what the experiments revealed, can't pretend the data doesn't exist just because obtaining it violated principles we now hold sacred. Some argue for acknowledgement without celebration, for remembering the volunteers and their suffering while using the knowledge they helped generate, for honoring contribution without endorsing methods. Others suggest the data should be buried, that using knowledge obtained through questionable means perpetuates the original ethical violation, that medicine should be pure, even if purity means ignorance. But ignorance has its own body count. The hypothermia victims who would die without proper treatment, the famine survivors who perished from refeeding syndrome, the countless patients whose lives depend on understanding purchased through wartime experiments. The volunteers themselves mostly avoid this debate. When interviewed, they tend toward pragmatism rather than philosophy, toward acceptance of what happened rather than agonizing over whether it should have happened. They volunteered. This fact matters to them even when consent was imperfect and understanding was incomplete. They chose participation, even if the choice was constrained by circumstance and pressure and the limited options available to conscientious objectors during wartime. The last survivors are dying now, the men who froze in Minnesota tanks and starved in dormitories and breathed mustard gas in sealed chambers, passing from living memory into historical record. Soon the experiments will exist only as data, numbers in journals and protocols in textbooks, knowledge divorced from the human experience that generated it. Perhaps this is inevitable. Perhaps all science eventually becomes abstract, the suffering that produced understanding fading until only the understanding remains. But something is lost in that abstraction. The human cost becomes invisible. The ethical complexity gets simplified into narratives of either heroic sacrifice or unconscionable exploitation. The truth that it was both simultaneously gets buried beneath the need for simple stories. The volunteers were not simply heroes. They were complicated people making complicated choices in desperate times, people who volunteered partly from altruism and partly from social pressure, partly from conviction and partly from lack of better options. The science was not simply evil, it was genuine research addressing urgent questions conducted by people who believed they were saving lives even when their methods caused suffering. The line between necessary medical research and human rights violation is not always clear. Context matters, intention matters, outcomes matter, but none of these things alone determine whether experiments were justified or whether the knowledge they produced should be used or discarded. You close your eyes, return from the cold water and the starvation and the chemical burns to the present, where medicine is more ethical and less certain, where protocols protect research subjects but sometimes slow the advancement of knowledge that might save lives. The volunteers of World War II exist in the gap between these imperatives, between protection and progress, between individual rights and collective benefit, between the desire to prevent suffering and the need to understand it. Their legacy is every person saved by protocols developed through their participation, every hypothermia victim who survives because doctors know how long consciousness persists in cold water, every famine survivor who lives because refeeding happens gradually rather than catastrophically. But their legacy is also the ethical frameworks that ensure such experiments won't happen again, at least not in the same way, at least not without oversight and consent and the right to withdraw that volunteers during wartime didn't fully possess. The story resists easy conclusions, resists the impulse to declare the experiments purely good or purely evil, to lionize the volunteers or condemn the researchers, to celebrate the knowledge or reject it as fruit from poisoned tree. Instead, it exists in uncomfortable middle ground, acknowledging that tremendous good came from ethically questionable means, that volunteers suffered for science that saves lives, that the same data can be simultaneously invaluable and tainted by the conditions of its creation. Perhaps that's the lesson, that history is complicated and humans are complicated, and the choices we make during crisis don't resolve neatly into categories of right and wrong. The volunteers made choices, imperfect choices, based on incomplete information, choices shaped by circumstance and conviction and the urgent needs of wartime. The knowledge they helped generate saves lives every day in hospitals and research facilities around the world, their suffering transformed into understanding that prevents other suffering.